What if I told you there's a place on Earth so silent, so desolate, that it swallowed 9 young lives without leaving a single clear answer? A mountain where tongues were torn out, bones were shattered with the force of a car crash, and bodies were found half naked in the snow, glowing with radiation. A place where the only witnesses were barefoot tracks leading into the dark, and the howling wind that never told the truth. This isn't folklore. This isn't a campfire story. This happened. 9 hikers full of life, full of dreams, walked into the frozen wilderness and never came back. Their tent was slashed open from the inside, their belongings left behind, and what was discovered scattered across the icy forest is still one of the most chilling mysteries in human history. For decades, people have asked, what really happened on the Mountain of the Dead? Was it a secret weapon test gone wrong? A hidden predator that leaves no tracks? Or something far older, something that has always belonged to that mountain? Tonight, we're diving deep into the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a story so terrifying. It has haunted investigators, scientists, and storytellers for more than 60 years. Stay with me until the end, because once you hear the details, you will never look at the snow the same way again. And if you love chilling true stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because the darkness is always closer than you think. They left Sverdlovsk in late January 1959 with the kind of confidence only youth and training can grant. 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, engineers in the making, skiers by necessity, idealists by temperament, signed the logbook for an advanced winter trek. Igor Dyatlov, 23, precise and stubborn, checked gear twice. Then again, aligning stove parts like a machinist laying out tools. He teased his friends, but his eyes lived on the map, thin pencil lines marching into a region the Monsi called Koletsyakal, Mountain of the Dead. Photos from the first days show faces red with cold and laughter. They sang on the train. They joked in the backs of trucks hired from collective farms. They documented everything. Film canisters tucked into wool, diaries sealed in oilskin. The expedition's goal was straightforward: Skito, Torton, and back. Rack up the distance and elevation needed for the highest certification. Brag only after. When the final drop-off truck chugged away, silence settled. A white world opened like an empty stadium. A field with no stands, no crowds, just wind and miles. The group moved as a system. Lead skier broke trail. 2 followed to stamp and set the glide. The last made sure no one fell behind. They stopped often to adjust bindings, to rub warmth into fingers, to check for frost nip. The cold was a thing with its own gravity. Exhale, and your breath turned to crystal. Blink, and lashes locked. The forest thinned. Hills rose, long shoulders covered in snow that squeaked when stepped on just right. Igor noted wind direction, snowpack, a shift in pressure. Weather was coming, he said. No one argued. By the time they reached the final valley before Koletsyakal, the sky had already decided. Clouds pressed down the light. The last photograph before the storm shows a fabric tent sprawled on fresh snow like a ship's hull before a launch. 9 shadows moving around it in purposeful lines. They didn't know they were already on the wrong slope. They should have dropped into the tree line for shelter. Instead, they pitched on the open shoulder of the mountain, a tilted plain where wind could get a running start. Why they stopped there remains an argument with no referee. Maybe they were behind schedule. Maybe Igor wanted to practice a high-slope camp. Maybe they'd lost the forest in the whitening storm and decided it was safer to dig in than to blunder downhill blind. The staking took forever. Wind kept grabbing the canvas and snapping it like a flag. They cut long blocks of snow for a low wall and anchored guy lines to the dead man bundles buried under the drift. Inside, they halved the tent with a center pole and hung a stove. Boots were stacked. Wet outerwear went near the warmest corner. A diary entry, tight handwriting, no flourishes, mentioned the roar of the wind, the jokes about a Siberian spa. They ate, fat and grain and something sweet. Someone tuned a mandolin for a few bars before the strings gave up. The stove hissed and clicked. A camera on a strap swung and bumped a shoulder. Frost grew on seams. Bodies made steam. Outside, the mountains sang in the gale, a deep, hard hum in the guy lines. They didn't know the slope above them was a wind-loaded shelf of snow. Not quite an avalanche, not quite harmless. The last human things they did were ordinary. Fold a sweater into a pillow, test a bootlace, write a date. One of them sketched a little caricature of Igor with a heroic jaw. Someone laughed, someone coughed, and sometime after midnight, something changed. A sound, a shudder, a pressure, a sense that the mountain had suddenly moved nearer. Investigators would later measure the cuts. Slashes from inside the canvas, jagged and frantic, as if the tent had become a trap. The stove was found unassembled, so it wasn't a fire. The pole hadn't broken. Nothing inside suggested a fight, but they tore their way out anyway, exiting into a night that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Bare footprints, socks, one felt boot, mostly naked feet, stitched down the slope in a ragged line. They were spaced like determined walking, not like a panicked stampede. The wind had filled some prints, but enough remained to map the first 100 meters. 9 shapes, then 7, then 6. Whatever pushed them from the tent hadn't chased in the snow. No other tracks were found. Searchers, weeks later, found the tent half collapsed, half buried. The canvas lay like a wounded animal, its sides stiff with ice. Inside were coats and a camera, a flask, a knife, bread, a slab of bacon. Everything you'd keep if you meant to face a Siberian night, abandoned. Nobody does that willingly. Not experienced hikers. Not in that cold. They either thought they'd be back in minutes, or they no longer cared about minutes. From the tent, the search party followed the footprints down to the darker band of the forest, where the wind hushed and the snow gathered in deeper folds. There, under a cedar whose lower branches had been stripped bare of needles, they found a blackened patch of ground and 2 bodies. The first 2 lay as if they'd simply sat down and refused to get up again, barefoot, nearly undressed. Their skin had the waxy sheen of those who lose a race with a cold. But it was their hands that bothered the men who found them, palms torn, fingers splintered with wood, bark under nails, a rind of blood frozen into lines. Someone had climbed that cedar in wild haste, tearing through branch after branch to reach height. To see the tent? To get dry wood? To escape? The fire ring at their feet was a miserable thing. Charred sticks that must have smoked more than burned, green needles popping and hissing. A few scraps of clothing lay nearby, stiff boards of frozen fabric. One of the boys had a mask of gray burns across his shin, as if head pressed too close to flame and never felt it. You can't feel much when the cold gets you first. Searchers looked up. Higher branches had been stripped for fuel. A rough platform bigger than a bird's nest and smaller than a bed had been hacked. The knife marks were ragged, inconsistent, more desperation than craft. One rescuer, an older hunter, turned his head, listening. He swore he heard a sound in the trees, like a whisper the wind couldn't make. They found 3 more bodies spaced between the cedar and the tent, in a slow-motion line of failure. One face down, one turned as if to crawl, one with arms locked across the chest, like head tried to conserve a last ember of warmth. The positions told a story. They had tried to go back. The spacing suggested a plan. Pairs breaking from the group, one to scout, one to follow, then another attempting the same when the first did not return. Their clothes were mixed, layers swapped, buttons crooked, as if they traded garments from the dead to gain an inch of warmth. They had injuries that didn't fit the night. A cracked skull with no scalp wound, ribs fractured without the messy pattern of a beating. It looked like what crash investigators call massive internal trauma. But there was no crash. There was only snow. When medics examined them later, they recorded what they could at the edge of a clearing wind. Lividity patterns, frost, tiny injuries. The wind erased details as they wrote. The men didn't linger. You could feel the cold as a weight in your teeth, a pressure behind your eyes. They left markers, then hauled the bodies away on sleds, faces covered, boots squeaking on the snow hard as glass. Between the cedar and the tent, the line of prints stopped making sense. Drifts had eaten the trail, down in a nearby ravine, for meters of snow over a shallow stream. The last 4 would be found months later, when spring softened the crust and a probing pole hit something that wasn't earth. The ravine had kept them, snow layered over their bodies, like paper laid over a secret. When the searchers opened the pit, it smelled of cold water and iron. The 4 lay with their mouths open, as if still trying to suck in warmth from the dark. 2 had broken ribs so severe their hearts must have sputtered. 1 woman's tongue was gone. Another's eyes were missing. Clothing on these bodies was better. Improvised wraps, a felt boot traded, a scarf used twice. But even that hadn't saved them. The medical examiner spoke and clipped notes, but privately he told a colleague the injuries were beyond what had seen in simple exposure. The chest damage resembled the force of a slow, crushing blow. No external bruising, organs bruised within. A riverbed cave-in? A fall into the ravine? But where then were the impact marks, the scatter of broken bones? He didn't have answers. He learned quickly not to invent them. The ravine water had started to melt around their bodies, dark ropes of current curling between pale limbs. Their clothes, when tested later, would show traces of radioactivity one would expect near a lab, not a hillside. The men in uniforms who watched from the trees didn't comment. They rarely did. The file that formed, the one you could see, was a collage of contradictions. A tent cut from within, bare feet walking in order, violent internal injuries without outside wounds, a tongue missing, radiation on clothing, a fire that couldn't catch, wind that sang, lights in the sky reported by villagers on the same night. The phrase that made it into the public record was careful, like a man picking his way across thin ice. Death caused by an unknown compelling force. Behind that, something else happened. The Institute urged quiet. The local office redacted names. Someone in a longer code and a flatter voice asked questions that weren't in the form. Families received belongings in sealed packages with items missing they swore had been there. A mother wrote to the authorities and received a reply that said nothing in 3 paragraphs. One of the student volunteers from the search had kept a diary. It disappeared for a time and then reappeared with a page torn out. He suddenly had a job offer in another city. Those who had stood in the ravine spoke softly in bars when they spoke at all. The mountain got its own mythology because the official narrative refused to grow. Weeks after the funerals, hunters spoke in kitchens with the curtains closed. They described orange orbs floating over the ridge lines that winter, slow, deliberate things that drifted the way a ship drifts when its engine fails. A train crew claimed a bright streak cut the horizon the night the hikers fled their tent. A few old men, Monsi, shook their heads and would not translate certain words. Soviet tests. Maybe. Rockets that fell where they shouldn't. Parachute mines designed to detonate above ground and crush lungs without tearing skin. It fit some of the wounds and none of the footprints. If an explosion had gone off, there'd have been a crater, char, a ring of evidence. There wasn't. If soldiers had stumbled on the campsite, there would have been tracks, shell casings, anything. There wasn't. Another story grew in the vacuum, something that moved without leaving prints, a sound that drove you mad with fear, infrasound from the wind vibrating on the slope until the human-animal panicked. A meteor? A snow slab that collapsed like a slow wave? An animal? Theories multiplied because the evidence didn't shrink to fit one. People chose the story that let them sleep. Years later, American readers devoured true crime magazines that devoted spreads to the case. The writers laid out diagrams like football plays. The tent here, the cedar there, the ravine beyond. They listed possibilities with the discipline of engineers and the appetite of novelists. Avalanche theory, a small slab release, enough to crush the tent pole, to convince experienced hikers they had seconds to escape. They cut out, moved laterally, intended to return. In the dark, the plan failed. The ones at the cedar built a fire while they waited for the slope to settle. The return party never made it, but the tent was still standing. The angle of the slope was borderline, and the injuries, especially those in the ravine, were still too violent. Parachute mine tests. Airbursts could break ribs without external trauma. Fear of a second blast could drive a team to flee barefoot. Authorities could explain the secrecy, the radiation, the warnings to families. But again, where were the fragments, the scorch, the official trail of a test? Human threat, escaped prisoners, hostile locals, soldiers. Yet there were no third-party tracks, no signs of struggle in the tent. Experienced fighters don't leave such a clean canvas. Environmental panic, infrasound from the wind, carbon monoxide from a stove, a freak auditory event that triggered fight or flight. The tent cuts were clean, the line of prints orderly. It almost worked as a narrative, until you returned to the ravine and the ghastly damage there. The neatest story never covered all 9 lives. What remained was a shape you could trace with your finger, but not fill in. Decades later, an American documentarian stood at the same slope in a rental parka and tried to speak above the wind. He had read the files, the diaries, the letters that survived the redactions. He carried a copy of a photograph, 9 young faces smiling into a future that didn't arrive. Had promised himself he wouldn't turn this into a ghost story. He wanted the human story, the choices made in seconds, the plans that almost saved them, the math of fear and cold. He set a tent where the old stakes had bitten. He listened to the guy lines hum in the wind, a low, nerve-plucking note. Standing there, he felt how the mountain compressed your world to a circle of noise and breath. If a slab shifted above, the sound might be less of a roar than a heavy exhale. In that sound, you might believe anything for a moment, that the slope would bury you, that the stove was poisoning you, that something outside the canvas was bigger than the cold itself. At dusk, he walked down to the treeline. The cedar was still there, scarred, older, taller. He touched the bark and felt grooves under his glove where hands had torn at it long before his time. He lit a small fire and watched it fight the wind and lose. He imagined 9 figures in the darkness, counting breaths, promising to move in 1 minute, then another. He imagined 2 deciding to go back. He imagined a ravine. When he finally spoke to the camera, he said the only honest thing left, that the truth here is cold, and cold erases. It erases tracks and reasons, and the right sequence of choices. It turns men into ideas. It turns a mountain into a myth. He packed his gear and climbed back to the tent, careful, deliberate, 1 step at a time, thinking of the line of footprints that went this way once and did not return. Long after he left, the wind kept singing in the lines, the only voice the place has ever offered freely. And on some nights, when the air is too still to be trusted, people say you can hear a second sound under the wind, like footsteps that start and stop, as if 9 friends are still trying to decide whether it's safe to go back. And so, the mountain still keeps its silence. 9 lives taken, tongues missing, bones crushed, radiation without a source. No clear answers, only questions that echo louder with every passing year. Was it the government hiding a deadly experiment? Was it something ancient, buried in the snow long before men dared to climb? Or was it the mountain itself, demanding a price no one could pay? One thing is certain, whatever happened on that frozen slope, it remains one of the most terrifying unsolved mysteries in history. And maybe, just maybe, the answers are still out there, waiting to be uncovered. If this story left you unsettled, shaken, or questioning the shadows that surround us, then join this journey into the unknown. Subscribe, leave a comment with your theory, and give this video a like, because the truth is still hiding in the dark. And together, we might just be the ones to find it.